Salufalaba, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susana Suisuiki. Coming up.
Someone ran to McDonald's Britomart to retrieve their defibrillator. My heart sank.
The widow of Green MP calls for an inquest. Also, French Minister for Overseas returns to New Caledonia. And
we are now finding that that same trait that was actually protective for our ancestors is maladaptive.
A new study looks at heart attacks among Fijians. The widow of late Green Party MP Whaanana Efeso Collins is calling for an inquest into his death, accusing the organisers of the charity event of failing him. Whaanana Efeso Collins died in February last year after suffering a cardiac arrest at a charity event in Auckland's Britomart. He, along with other participants, spent the morning racing with water buckets to raise awareness of clean drinking water in the Pacific for Child Fund. A case management conference was held at the Auckland Specialist Courts and Tribunals to consider whether there should be an inquest. Grace Fever-Eye was there and filed this report.
It's been 399 days since Whaanana died, and his widow, Fia Vasa Collins, says she has many questions about the circumstances surrounding his death. She wants to know if the 49-year-old first-term MP would still be alive if there had been better health and safety support on hand at the Child Fund event. Vasa says she doesn't believe everything possible was done to save her husband's life.
When I arrived at the mortuary, the police sat me down and told me that after Efeso collapsed, someone ran to McDonald's Britomart to retrieve their defibrillator. My heart sank. What deeply concerned me was when I asked the police why a defibrillator had to be brought from McDonald's, their response was because there was only a first aid kit on site. Since then, people have come forward to share their accounts, some as recent as last week.
Coroner Janet Anderson said the purpose of today's hearing was to gain a better understanding of the situation. She's seeking clarification around the timing of when the defibrillator was administered.
Essentially, there is some uncertainty around whether, perhaps where the defibrillator came from, B, whether the timing we're talking about is 2 minutes or 4 to 5 minutes. I think there's an essential question that's very relevant to my ability to even consider making recommendations or inquiring into some of these issues.
Counsel for Child Fund NZ Tanya Goatley said they appreciated the coroner's decision to seek further clarification, but were confident all necessary health and safety measures were put in place on the day.
Although Child Fund had not itself run this particular version of this event prior, it did hire Campbell & Co, which is an extremely experienced event management company, to ensure that everything was done as it should have been. We had thought it was clear that in fact what happened on the day was that the chain of command was followed as it should have been. There is a standard protocol in place.
Vasa said it will be difficult to move on until she has answers.
I think once we turn a leaf and we have that closure and those answers, then we'll be able to plan for an unveiling and to give him the ma'a that he deserves and celebrate his life wholly.
The coroner has requested all additional evidence supporting statements and witnesses' statements by the end of April for consideration.
Australia's Labour government is continuing to maintain its multi-billion-dollar foreign aid support, with Tuesday's budget announcing around 5 billion Australian dollars would go to the sector. There will be substantial commitment to the Pacific, and money has also been earmarked to fill some of the spaces left behind by the US withdrawal of aid. Cameron Hill is a senior researcher with the Development Policy Centre at the Australian National University, and Don Wiseman asked him for his analysis of the aid elements of the latest budget.
Well, it's pretty much steady as she goes on foreign aid here. I mean, the Labor government committed a couple of years ago to keep the aid budget flat in real terms pretty much over the next decade or more. So that means there wasn't any aid cuts, but there wasn't any real aid increases. I guess one of the notable features was that the government said it was making some adjustments to the program in light of the potential impacts of US aid cuts, particularly health programs in PNG and Fiji. But altogether, the basic structure of the aid budget remains. The Pacific is going to get 42% of all Australian aid. Southeast Asia is going to get about 25% of the $5 billion in Australian aid next financial year. South Asia gets about 7%, Africa and the Middle East get 3%, and then global programs get about 22%. So the basic structure of the Australian aid budget remains stable.
I think a lot of Western countries right now are looking at cutting their aid back and putting those dollars into defence spending. Not the case in Australia.
Australia is increasing its defence spending, but for the moment, it's not cutting aid to do that. Australia already has one of the highest defence to development spending ratios in the OECD. We spend 10 times as much on defence, well, I think 11 now with this budget, 11 times as much on defence as we do on aid. And even on current projections, and even without cutting aid, that's going to rise to about 13 to 1 by the end of the decade. So look, but this could be an election issue. As you know, we have a federal election coming up. It hasn't been announced yet, but it will be in May. And, you know, there are noises, particularly in conservative media outlets here, that we should be increasing the defence budget to 2.5% of GDP or even 3% of GDP. And some on the conservative side of politics have mooted cutting foreign aid to help pay for that.
A substantial amount of money, as has been the case for several years, coming to the Pacific. And some of the countries going to receive a bigger lift than others, particularly Tonga. Why?
In the summary of the development budget that DFAT put out, it said that there'd be a new $75 million package of budget support for Tonga. And I think the first tranche of that gets paid next financial year in 25-26. So yeah, that is a big boost for Tonga. Australia has moved towards more budget support for the Pacific, particularly during COVID. That's come off a bit post-COVID, but yeah, Tonga is a winner. I guess, you know, if you're a recipient of aid, you probably prefer to have the money to put directly in your budget than in the form of projects delivered by third parties. So yeah, I think this is a recognition that Tonga has some pretty challenging fiscal circumstances, and it's obviously made the case that it needs budget support to help it navigate those.
Yes, well, I was speaking with Biman Prasad in Fiji, and he was lauding Australia for this commitment to budget support and wanted to see other aid donors do similar things all around the Pacific. But Australia's, the amount of money it's putting into budget support is still pretty low, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I think it got up to about 9% or so in the last couple of years. It's dropped back down to about 6%, I think. Yeah, I mean, as an overall proportion, but I think it's something that Pacific states and leaders like Biman Prasad are continuing to push hard for. You know, these are small countries. Many of them have lots of small aid donors. You know, Australia's a big aid donor, but, you know, there's smaller aid donors wanting to do more in the Pacific. And, you know, there's coordination challenges that come with that. If you've got lots of donors doing lots of individual projects, you know, that becomes, the transaction costs of that for Pacific governments are quite high. So, you know, I think they're right to say to Australia and other donors, look, it's much more effective and efficient if you back our development plans and you really want to say that you're listening to our priorities, then put a portion of your money in our budgets. That's, I guess, a version of locally led development, which is something that, you know, the development sector says that it wants to see more of. So, yeah, let's see where this goes. It's something we'll be watching pretty closely over the next few years.
Do you think there is nervousness within the Australian government about how that money might be spent?
Yeah, look, I think there is always that trade-off between kind of control versus perhaps more impact through budget support, but losing that control you might have with project aid. I think last year Australia did an evaluation of its budget support programs in the Pacific during COVID and found generally that they were effective. But yeah, the case still has to be made, and there still has to be confidence that the systems that budget support is going through are up to scratch. And I would argue that alongside budget support, Australia should be working on those, accountability institutions within governments, within parliaments in the Pacific that do help ensure that this money gets to where it's going to have the most impact. So, yeah, there is that trade-off, I guess, between the level of control a donor might have over its funding versus the potential impact of pooling its funding with a government's funding to achieve development outcome.
Now, the money Australia's allocating to cover any gaps caused by an American pullout, is that money assigned at this point, or is it just a matter of waiting to see just where those gaps appear?
Look, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty around the US cuts. The big question in the Pacific, I guess, is the future of the compact funding that goes to countries like Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia. That's where the bulk, I think about 80% of US aid money into the Pacific goes, is to those three countries. And I think that's yet to be seen, what the Trump administration does with that funding, which was appropriated by Congress in 2024. Outside of those three countries, looks like the DFAT, the Australian government, has seen that the projects that are likely to be cut that it is most concerned about are TB and HIV programs in PNG and Fiji. And so what it's done in this budget is it's taken some of the money it was going to spend on global programs, global health, global education programs, and shifted that money across to help buttress health programs, particularly in PNG, Fiji. I think also there's some additional support this financial year for some of the civil society programs that the US has supported in the Pacific, and civil society organizations to help make sure that those projects don't fall over. So I think health in PNG, health in Fiji are the big ones for now, but obviously, the full implications of this are still washing through, and the government said it's still watching where these cuts are going to fall, particularly in the Pacific.
In New Caledonia, politicians from all sides are preparing for the return of French Minister for Overseas, Manuel Valls. Less than 1 month after his previous visit, high on the agenda are further talks about the French Pacific Territory's political future. Koroi Hawkins spoke to Patrick de Cloyter from RNZ's French Pacific desk.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for sitting with him, Yumi. What has been Manuel Valls' approach to these negotiations, and do you think they've been successful so far?
I think the main difference is the approach. While previous ministers have been seen to force the time frame, Manuel Valls at least is perceived as being more sensitive to the Melanesian way. So the main difference is definitely the approach. And he also has good knowledge of New Caledonia's issues because he was involved in talks that led to previous peace deals with New Caledonia back in 1988 and 10 years later in 1998, and even more recently as a French Prime Minister. So he has that kind of experience, but is still walking on a very tight rope. Reconcile two very different views, those who want New Caledonia to remain part of France and those who want full sovereignty.
How significant is it that all sides have joined these recent discussions for the first time in years now?
Well, it's very significant because after a series of 3 referendums that ended in December 2021, all political parties were supposed to meet and agree on the next steps and which course of action to take. And that was mainly in order to produce a new agreement that would replace the 1998 Noumea Accord. There was 1 week of talks last month in New Caledonia with Valls, and the main achievement was to bring everyone around the same table to voice their respective positions and perceptions. And this is something that had not happened since the last referendum, end of 2021. So, to say the least, there's a lot of differences and disagreements.
What are the most significant elements in this synthesis paper he published at the end of his previous visit last month?
Now, those disagreements are all put down on paper in this document. However, all parties are saying this is not a document on negotiations, it's only discussions, but it's the basis for further talks. And it puts a finger on very sensitive issues like who will and who will not qualify as a New Caledonian future citizen. And very important as well, how will New Caledonia be described in future and what status it will have vis-à-vis France. Several options: free association, shared sovereignty, no change, or short-term independence. It's anyone's guess.
As Manuel Valls returns to New Caledonia this weekend, is there hope for some sort of agreement and peace between all sides?
The atmosphere is very tense. It will be very difficult to reconcile everyone's opposing views. Even Manuel Valls, in a recent interview last week on French media, said an agreement was still very far from being concluded, and he wants to stay humble about the whole thing. On one side, you have the pro-independence camp, which stresses the path to pursue and complete the decolonization process. On the other side, you have the pro-France parties who are saying there have already been 3 referendums in recent years and they all rejected the notion of independence. There is hope. There's a lot of hope. But there's also a fear that once again there could be no agreement at all because of a lack of goodwill to reach a compromise between all parties. So the reality is that you have a lot of people there, including business leaders, who are saying they need a new agreement so that confidence returns and they can start investing again after the destruction from the riots of May last year.
Thank you, Thomas Patrick. Always a pleasure. Thank you, Thomas, for sitting on Story with Tim Milo, RNZ Pacific.
Researchers at Otago University are seeking answers to why Fijian New Zealanders are at higher risk of having heart attacks at a young age. I spoke to Heart Foundation Research Fellow Dr. Pratika Narayan about the study.
So we are investigating the first ever genetic study of coronary artery disease for peoples of Fiji. We need to do this because we have very little representation when it comes to genetic studies across the world. So majority of genetic studies are actually representative of 85% European ancestry peoples. We have very little representation in understanding the genetic drivers of premature coronary artery disease. And given the very high rates, so we are talking not only that we're 2% of Aotearoa's population, but 20% of heart attacks under 40 years of age are occurring among peoples of Fiji. But we also see this striking pattern. So, where it's a grandparent, a child, and a grandparent affected by heart disease. And often this is fatal in a lot of the affected families. So under 30 years of age, we're seeing a lot of people dying of cardiac arrests at home. And this all leads to or indicates that there is a strong genetic driver that is actually causing this. I'm not saying that diet and lifestyle are not involved. They definitely play a role, but what we are saying is that independent of those factors, there should not be these deaths occurring so young in these families. There must be a genetic driver, and to see that trait being inherited across, the generations is just really alarming, and it really needs attention. So, that's why we're doing this study for peoples of Fiji. Yeah.
Why specifically Fijians?
People of Fiji have a very unique history. So there is the indigenous population, the Itoke, where 40% of the population dies as soon as Fiji is ceded. And while that's an average number, 40% across the board, some regions, some islands, that would have wiped out the entire population actually in those islands. And so what we know that can cause is these genetic bottlenecks or, certain traits that allowed people to survive become more popular in the population that survives, right? So that's for the Itoke. And then for the indentured labourers or Girmit population that is trafficked to Fiji between 1879 and 1916, that population undergoes quite a severe famine. And we know this is documented both in the death indenture records, but also in the rations that are actually documented and given who the work is. It's less than 1,700 calories a day for 13 hours of hard manual labor, and it's just not enough food. And so you see very high rates of infant mortality, very high rates of death during childbirth, and the hypothesis is that what if there were traits that were enabling the people who did survive to survive because they had a genetic trait that allowed them to maybe store fat in atypical regions so that they could actually, draw on that resource when they're starving. But now, in an urban context where we have this relative abundance of food, right, we are now finding that same trait that was actually protective for our ancestors is maladaptive. Same thing with the itoke. What if those traits that maybe allowed ancestors to survive those infectious diseases, that maybe was protective then, is maladaptive in an urban context? And so driving maybe increased inflammatory risk, or, we don't know. And that's what we want to investigate.
I also understand that this is going to be a community-led study. So how many from the Fiji community here in Aotearoa are you approaching?
So we hope to recruit at least 40. We can recruit up to 200. And we are looking for people who meet the eligibility criteria for our study. So that is anyone who has either Fijian or Itoke ancestry or Fijian Indian Girmit ancestry, anyone who has experienced their first heart attack or a related surgery, i.e. stent put in or a bypass, under the age of 55 years, and anyone who is a permanent resident or citizen of New Zealand. So if those three criteria are met for anyone, they are eligible for our study.
And just to confirm, Pratika, the study will take 3 years?
Yes, so we're a year in. We've got 2 years to go. So yes, we hope by the end of this 2 years to go that we will have a clear indication of some genetic drivers that are actually driving this risk for affected families. Yes.
You've just mentioned earlier that you're hoping for tailored treatment for this disease, but what else are you hoping to achieve from your study?
Oh man, I've got big dreams. But one really simple thing is when a community leads the research themselves, they are directly involved and there is representation of us and, it's data about us with us. And that is so, so, so important in work like this. It means that not only can we diagnose this early in affected families, but then that genome-based medicine where we so need equity, because so many of genome-based medicines in the world are based on European populations. So it's hoping to develop and understand how we can improve that for diverse peoples like peoples of Fiji.
That's Pacific Waves for today. For all episodes, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā soifua.